Hi, everybody. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 60 different charts that I looked at where the people were all spies, either for part of their life or for like the majority of their working life. Some of them were caught and imprisoned or executed. Some like lived to be older and then either like wrote a book about it or were interviewed about it, about their time as a spy. Um, so there's a wide range of experiences here. So I'm just going to say right off the bat, like not every spy. It's not like a monolithic thing where it's just like, this is what it means to be a spy. This is what their general experience would be like, and this is how you see it in a chart, because that's not the case at all. There's a wide range of what it means to be a spy, what their intentions were, what their methods were, how it went for them, um, how long they did it for, whether they were sort of forced by circumstance into it or chose it, like actively went out of their way to have that kind of career. And so I wasn't sure if I would even see anything that was similar across all of the charts or a lot of the charts. And I was inspired. Well, I had actually already been thinking of making this video, and then I saw something online where somebody claimed, someone I don't know, they claimed that they had studied spies charts and that they had seen certain things, certain patterns. And I was curious if they were true. Some of them sounded like, okay, that could be true, like heavy Scorpio placements or um, 12th house placements or very like plutonic looking charts or they also said like heavy sixth house placements. And some of these things I found to actually hold up and other ones I did not. So it was just really interesting for me. I thought it was fun, so I wanted to do it. But I will share it with all of you, and then hopefully some of you will also find it interesting. So first I'm just going to talk about the different things that I saw. So I used 60 charts because that was actually basically all I could find. And I was also trying to do a multiple of 12 just to make it easy for me to tell like if it was statistically like more than you would expect for a given placement. Like for a house placement or a sign placement, then it's easy to divide the number by 12 and figure like, okay, I would expect to see approximately 5 charts out of 60 with a certain placement in a certain house. And then, I would just sort of look at it and think like, "Oh, okay, there's obviously gonna be a range that could be just totally random." Like you could have 8 of something and that's just random by chance, whatever. But if I start seeing like 10 or more, then I start thinking, okay, that's double what I would have expected to see for a particular placement. Um, so that's kind of how I approached it. And it's not like, obviously very scientific or mathematically precise, but, astrology isn't always like that anyway. It's often very qualitative. And like when I look at, after I go through the things that I saw pattern wise and numbers wise, I will work my way through just like briefly touching on 21 different specific charts, just so you can see how like each chart might have like one or two of these things in it. None of them have all of it or even most of it. Um, and then see how like the parts that aren't part of the overall patterns still make sense. Like when you put it all together, like each piece, it's part of a puzzle that adds up to this making sense because that's how astrology works, right? So it's like the whole picture. Okay, so I just did a little summary here, but I have more notes that I want to make sure I look at it and don't miss anything. So let's see. The first thing that I noticed and the most interesting to me because it was by far the most um, like skewed number compared to any other placement, which was Cancer rising. 17 out of the 60 charts that I saw had Cancer rising. And it wasn't like I was looking for a particular type of spies charts. Like basically what I did was I looked at any that I could find on that I had on Solar Fire, and then I went through Astro Databank and I looked at their website and I looked and I searched for spy, and then I tried to look through because sometimes it would be like someone who wrote a book about spies or was in a spy movie or something. So I tried to look through and find people that had legitimately worked in some kind of espionage in their life, regardless of what the circumstance was. Like you'll see, I'll get to like Julia Child later. Like she just did it for a brief period of time, or there were a couple people where it's sort of like they were forced into it by circumstance, but like I still counted them. And really, 60 was about what I could find. I was like shooting for 48, and then I kept finding more, and I was like, okay, I'll go till 60. And then like I got to the upper 50s, and I was like, I don't know if I'm going to find 60. So That's just to say that this is really what I could find because there's not like a ton of like reliably timed charts for spies out there. It's kind of antithetical to the craft, I guess, to espionage itself. So 17 out of the 60 charts had Cancer rising. That seems very significant to me. And I thought it was really interesting. And I wondered if it has to do with like the patriotic quality of Cancer rising. I also wondered about the charts are. There's a lot of people who were working as spies during World War II. So a lot of people born around the same time. They are all over the place though, and it wasn't true that like all the Cancer rising charts were from the same time, but I wondered if that could have been part of the reason why it was so skewed, is that perhaps that led to certain placements of outer planets that therefore just like that was the aspect that made it more likely, but it didn't seem to me as I was going through the 17 Cancer rising charts that there was like anything that necessarily screamed like this is why they're all Cancer rising, other than the fact that they were Cancer rising. And I also thought about like the lunar quality of Cancer rising people and how the moon can shift and adapt and change, and the connection of the moon with messages and how much of espionage can be about passing messages and information. And there are also, you would expect, a lot of very mercurial people um, that work in espionage. And so the second most likely rising sign was with only 7, just to give context, but it's still more than 5, which would be the average if you divide it by 12. But that was 7 with Virgo rising. So because 17 of the 60 charts went to Cancer, 7 was definitely like the second place. A lot of them had like 0, 1, 2. So just throwing that out there. So that's the most significant thing that I saw was the Cancer rising. And let's see. And like I said, clearly I am not a statistician. So the most common sun sign was Taurus, although part of this could be the Cancer rising component because 7 of the Cancer rising signs had Taurus in the 11th house. So is it about Taurus or is it about the sun in the 11th? The 11th house was also the most likely house for the sun to be in, regardless of sign. And yet also Taurus was the most common sun sign. So both of those things seem to be relevant. Let's see. The most common combination of rising sign and sun sign by far, with 7 examples compared to 0 to 2 for any other combo, was Cancer rising with Taurus for um, the sun and Taurus. So let's see. So the sun was in the 11th house in 10 out of 60 of the charts. So double what you would expect if you were just dividing it up evenly. Um, 7 of those were Cancer risings, and then there were 3 others. The second most likely house for the sun was the 9th house, with 8 out of 60 of the charts having that placement, and it was not specific to any particular rising sign. The most common angular planets were Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto. I calculated angular as in 5-degree orb from any angle. And if you consider 5 degrees on either side of each angle, it gives you about an 11% chance of having a given planet within orb. So you would expect 6 to 7 of the charts on average to have that a given planet angular. Jupiter and Pluto were each angular in 9 examples. Saturn was angular in 11 examples. So that seems a little bit more statistically relevant. If I break it down by specific angles, the placements I saw the most were Mars or Neptune on the ascendant, Venus or Pluto on the IC, Jupiter, Uranus, or Saturn on the descendant. And I did not see any patterns really with the midheaven. I was curious if there were common stelliums for spies, and I defined stellium as 4 planets, including outer planets, in a sign, and there were 15 of the 60 charts. And to be honest, I don't know if that is statistically relevant or not because I don't actually know how many people have stelliums in their charts percentage-wise, and I did not spend the time trying to figure that out. So regardless, out of those 15 charts, 4 of them had a stellium in Gemini in different houses. And the most common house for a stellium was the first house, with 4 people also having a first house stellium out of the 15 charts with stelliums. So that would be 1 in the first house, 1 in, sorry, that was four people with first house stelliums, 1 in Cancer, 1 in Gemini, 2 in Libra. Um, And like I said, Gemini was the most common sign to have a stellium in. 4 out of those 15 charts had that. The most common moon sign was Aries, and that was 11 out of 60 charts, so that feels important. So that's the Aries moon. The moon was most likely to be in the first, second, or ninth house. If I'm looking only at the big three, then the most common would be Cancer rising, Taurus sun, Aries moon. But out of the 60 charts, only one, Edmund Ironside, had all three of those. Um, like I said, a lot of these charts would have just like a really prominent placement that was one of these things or a few of these things, but not, all 20 or whatever of these different characteristics. Okay, so almost half of the charts, 26 out of 60, had at least one of those three, Cancer rising, Taurus sun, or Aries moon. You would expect more like 15. This is probably mostly due to that huge number of Cancer rising charts that skews the number. But then 4 of the Cancer rising charts also have an Aries moon, and 7 of the Cancer charts also have the sun in Taurus. So those are just popular combinations that you see here. And then one of the charts has both Taurus sun and Aries moon with the Cancer rising. That was Edmund Ironside that I mentioned. And that means that 10 out of the 17 of the Cancer rising charts also have Taurus sun or Aries moon as well. Okay. The most common Mars sign was Gemini. That was 10 out of 60 charts having Mars in Gemini. The most common houses for Mars were the 11th house, which is also 10 out of 60, the 10th house, 9 out of 60, and the first house, 8 out of 60. Mercury was most likely to be in the 4th house, 9 out of 60. Most likely to be in Aquarius, the 9th house. Wait, why did I say 9th house? Oh, I meant 9 out of 60, sorry. And then yet only one person had a 4th house Mercury in Aquarius. Um, Let's see. The nodes, 9 out of 60 people had the north node in the 4th house and the south node in the 10th house, and that did not seem to be based on rising sign. I was worried at first that maybe that was just like a rising sign, Cancer rising thing that was skewing it, but it really did seem to be regardless of rising sign. The south node ending up in the 10th and the north node ending up in the 4th was something I saw 9 out of 60 times. Um, and let's see, when it came to Venus, nothing seemed super notable. It was slightly more likely to be in the 11th house, and it was the only time where Scorpio was one of the top signs to come up. So that was one of the things that I had gone into this wondering about Scorpio with spies, and it really didn't show up, to be honest. Like a lot of the times, it was one of the least represented signs, and yet with Venus, it did show up a little bit more, 8 out of 60 charts, along with Taurus, 8 out of 60. And so that was one thing. Venus didn't really seem like super relevant. I did notice it a little bit more often than not on the IC compared to other planets being angular. So let's see what else. So I also expected a higher number of 12th house placements. And not that I didn't see them, but I saw a greater emphasis on first, seventh, ninth, 10th, and 11th houses. Um, The only planet out of all the planets that was most likely to be in the 12th house was Pluto. Pluto was most likely to be in the 12th of the first. And the ruler of the 10th house was also most likely to be in the 12th house, and that was 9 out of 60 charts. Um, a I felt like when I left the topics a little bit more vague and just based on my like gut feeling looking at all of the charts, which I know is going to drive you nuts if you love statistics, that like broadly defining something as prominent or like striking, there were other things that I noticed. Like I really felt like Neptune being prominent in some way, like a close aspect to something, or in an angular house, or even on an angle, or um, like in a position that somehow, one way or another, felt really important in the chart. So prominent Neptune or Pluto were things that felt true to me that I had seen as part of the claims online. And another thing that I didn't notice, that I hadn't seen, but that I definitely noticed when I looked at the charts was prominent Mars, Cancer rising, as I mentioned, Aries and Gemini emphasis in general, either for the chart ruler, the moon, Mars, and let's see, that's like the bulk of it. The only other thing I'm gonna mention is like other planets by house. So Pluto's most likely to be in the first or the 12th house. That accounted for 16 of the 60 charts. Neptune was most likely to be in the first or the seventh. That accounted for 17 of the 60 charts. And remember, you'd expect it to be about 10 of 60 for two houses. Um, Jupiter was most likely to be in the seventh. 10 out of 60 charts, that seems really relevant. And I'm still trying to work that one out for myself because I did see Jupiter in the seventh a lot. Um, and Jupiter, like within 5 degrees of the descendant in particular. And then Saturn was most likely to be in the seventh or the 10th, and that was 18 of 60 charts. So those are just all the numbers. If you find it interesting, hopefully you do. Now I'm going to get into looking at the charts. All right, so we're going to start with Josephine Baker. I did talk about her a little bit in my Uranus transits video, where I went through just a few different people's lives and looked at their major Uranus transits to their charts and saw what those could look like in real life. So I've been reading about her life a lot lately, so she's probably going to show up in a couple of videos from here on out. It's a lot of work to really study one person's whole life and like look at their charts and their transits and progressions and locational stuff, like everything. And so, as I'm learning a person, I am becoming very well aware, like as I'm learning about their life and their astrology, that I am going to keep going back to these examples because it gets like so ingrained and like I feel like I really know it now. Okay, so she was Virgo rising, which, like I pointed out, second most likely rising sign for a spy. She had a Gemini stellium, and she in her 10th house, and the ruler of her 10th house was, I'm sorry, the chart ruler was in her 10th house, and Mars was in Gemini in the 10th house. And so all of those things were things that came up on my list of like more common placements, right? Additionally, the moon in the second house, Saturn in the seventh house, Pluto in the 10th house, those were all things that I saw in several charts. She worked as a spy for 5 years between 1939 to 1944. Pluto entered her 12th house in 1939 as she was beginning to work as a spy, and it made it to 9 Leo in her 12th by the time that she was finished. Uranus moved from 21 Taurus in her ninth house to 12 Gemini in her 10th house in the time that she worked as a spy. So it's stationed conjunct her sun weeks before her heroic return to Paris after the war. And the North Node moved from her second house to her first to her 12th, which we're going to see that happen in several people's charts, that the North Node in the or the South, either node in the first or the 12th are moving between one to the other, and their time that they worked as a spy comes up a lot, I've noticed. Um, and while it was in her 12th house, it also coincided with she was in the hospital for a really long time, and she was really sick. And yet, while she was in the hospital, she was also like holding meetings, like intelligence meetings, and like it became sort of the working space for that in she was in Casablanca. Okay, so after the 12th, it went into the 11th house in 1944, the North Node did, which is when she returned to Paris a hero. And I like that both sorry, I'm blanking. Both the North, no, I haven't gotten to it yet, is Saturn. That's what it was. Okay. So the North Node makes it to her 11th house by the time she's recognized as a hero. And then we also have Saturn, which while she's working as a spy, moves through her entire ninth house. And I saw the ninth house come up a lot. With spy work, by the way, like that international focus, I think is really what's going on there, but also like your beliefs and what you believe in and like what you're willing to die for in a lot of these cases. But so anyway, Saturn moves through her entire ninth house and her 10th house, and then it was stationing in her 11th house on her Venus Neptune conjunction when she was recognized as a hero after the war. So you have the North Node moving into the 11th as Saturn is stationing there with her 11th house conjunction. And that's when she gets the recognition from people at large. And yes, that sounds very 10th house, but also like she was really just like loved by the people, and having those natal placements there in the 11th, I think has a lot to do with that part of her life, like the way that the Parisian people just adored her. Um, and like her like icon status basically. So let's see. I skipped a couple things to get to Saturn. Neptune was in her first house, squaring her 10th house Mars when she started. And in the story of her life, like transits to her Mars really do, they feel extra significant. And so she starts spying as Neptune is squaring off with her Mars, right? And then it transits into her second house, Neptune does, by the time she's done spying. And I do feel like there's kind of a sense of like, okay, what next after that? Like after the war was over and like she's a hero, but then I think there's like it seems like from what I read, there's a bit of a period of like, okay, now what? Um, and she was still like performing and all of that, but then she decided to focus more on like she started adopting children and all of that afterwards. And she would still like attend public events in her like full military uniform. It was like an important part of her identity. So I would imagine that as Neptune's entering her second house, the war is ending. She's like really become attached to this new identity she has for herself, and then it's just sort of like over. That there was like some confusion there too. So that is Josephine Baker. All right, and here we have Belle Boyd. She was a spy for the Confederate Army. She would go into the Union soldiers' camps and get information, sort of trick them into it. And she, let's see. So she has Cancer rising. She's got the Sun in the 11th house in Taurus. That was a combination I saw several times. She has the Mars in Gemini in the 12th house, which is also the ruler of her 10th house in the 12th house. She's got Pluto and Uranus in the 10th, Neptune with the Moon, which is the chart ruler. Um, so she has a lot of different characteristics that I saw as like major patterns showing up in spies charts. You can see that Venus on her ascendant, and I think that that being unique to her wasn't a pattern I saw amongst charts, but she was also using like her beauty and her feminine appeal, I guess you could say, to get information in her work as a spy. She started her career, I guess, started when she actually shot a Union soldier for his disrespectful way of talking to her and her mother. And that was July 1861. And she, starting in July 1862, was arrested several times. And by December 1863, so like 2.5 years after she first starts spying, she was banished to the South. And then she ended up going to England, getting married, and she doesn't work as a spy again after that. So it's just a couple of years we're looking at, 2.5 years. And primarily that first year and then that second year ends up being a lot more about the like arrest, going back to work, getting arrested. Like she was really in and out of jail at that time. So her career, or she was in jail and like actively like being like very disruptive. I read about like her like trying to hang the Confederate flag out her jail cell window or something like that. Um, she seemed like quite the character. So her career started, I told you that, with the murder of the Union soldier. And that was as Neptune was stationing retrograde at 1 Aries conjunct her Uranus in the 10th house and square her ascendant and descendant. So she would have been a good one for my Uranus video. Transiting Uranus was on her south node at 14 Gemini, and by the time she was done, it was at 23 Gemini, trine her natal Neptune and sextile her natal Pluto and square her natal Jupiter. So Uranus was like really a big part of these transits that coincided with her entire spying career. She, let's see, the South Node moved from her first house and through her 12th while she worked as a spy. Pluto was in her 11th house, squaring Saturn in her 8th, and Saturn's the ruler for 7th and 8th the whole time she was working as a spy, which I think all of that plays to like the difficulty with other people, right? The 7th, the 8th, the 11th. And yeah, that's pretty much all I want to say about her. So that's Belle Boyd. All right, so now this is Aldrich Ames's chart. I looked at the pronunciation on Google, so hopefully it's right. He was an American CIA officer who turned KGB double agent. He started spying for the Russians April 16th, 1985. He was convicted of espionage in 1994. He has this first house Gemini stellium. He has Mars in the 10th. He has Neptune squaring the chart ruler. So you see how like it's hard to say, but there's always something with Neptune. Not always, but a lot of times there's something key with Neptune. That like lack of clarity about like their who they are, like especially for other people, you know. When he and I also love the Gemini rising and the double agent combination. I think that's kind of funny. All right. And I can say that because I'm a Gemini rising. When he started spying, it was an eighth house perfection year ruled by Saturn. Saturn in the sixth house, exactly opposite his natal Uranus. Saturn was at 26 Scorpio, and Mars was applying to conjunction with his natal Uranus in the 12th house at 23 Taurus. So Saturn and Mars were both activating that natal Uranus, and Saturn, remember, was the lord of the year. Um, Saturn and Mars were also squaring his midheaven and IC, and the North Node was in his 12th house conjunct his natal Saturn. So there's Saturn getting activated again in this year that was a Saturn perfection year. While he was a spy from 1985 to 1994, Pluto made its way through his sixth house from 3 to 26 degrees Scorpio. And so that would also be like opposite his 12th house placements, remember? Um, because he is one of the charts where you really do see that 12th house emphasis, Jupiter, Uranus, Saturn. Okay. And the nodes during the time that he's spying, those 9 years, the nodes make it halfway around the chart, and his north node starts conjunct his natal Saturn in the 12th house. And then by the time he's done spying, it's the south node there conjunct his Saturn when he's sentenced. So that also feels significant. Let's see. Pluto stationed retrograde at 28 Scorpio opposite his 12th house Jupiter, and Uranus in the time between his and his wife's arrest and his sentencing in April 1994. And it was at 27 Scorpio when he was sentenced to life in prison. So when his wife was sentenced 6 months later, Pluto was once again opposite his natal Uranus and Jupiter at 26 Scorpio. And Jupiter is the ruler of his seventh house. So his wife was actually like aiding and abetting his espionage. And that Jupiter, the ruler of the seventh in the 12th, especially with the 12th being activated so much with his spy work, and then being activated in such a big way when they are both arrested and then separately as they're each sentenced, seems really, really interesting. And also the fact that Pluto was opposite that natal Uranus and Jupiter, both when he was sentenced and then also when his wife was sentenced because of stationing and all that. It took some time between their sentencing, but the Pluto location was very similar. All right. So while he was a spy, Uranus moved retrograde from 17 Sag in his seventh house to station opposite his natal Venus at 13 Sag. Then it crossed his descendant at 21 Sag. So you can see how his wife is like involved in this, right? Like first it's like he's starting and Uranus is activating his natal Venus, and then his descendant soon after. Then it makes his way through his eighth house, ending at 26 Capricorn, trine his natal Uranus in the 12th, and also his natal Jupiter, which rules the seventh, as well as his natal Neptune in the fourth. So I really like his chart as a great example of how it can look when the wife is also involved or the spouse is also involved in the espionage. Neptune worked his way through his eighth house and was trying his natal Uranus and Neptune when he was sentenced as well. So, yeah, and anything that's trining the Uranus is also like applying to a trine with that Jupiter, and as long as it's moving direct. And so that Uranus in the 12th seems to be and the Saturn seem to be a major part of him as a spy, and then that Jupiter there is being activated anytime those are, and his wife was like along for the ride. So, and an active participant. So that is Aldrich Ames. This is the chart of Louise de Bettigny. That's my best guess. She was a French secret agent who spied on the Germans for the British during World War I using the pseudonym Alice Dubois. She was nicknamed the Queen of Spies by her English superiors, and she has Virgo rising, the chart ruler, and the ruler of the 10th house, both in the 12th house. She has the moon in the second house. She has the sun in the 11th and Venus in the 11th. And she started working as a spy in October 1914, was arrested October 1915. So only really worked for a spy as for a year. And then she died in prison 3 years later in 1918. When she started, Neptune had just entered her 12th house. Pluto went from 2 to 3 degrees Cancer in her 11th house in an 11th house perfection year during this 1 year that she was spying, approaching her south node. And then 3 years after she was arrested, when she died, it finally reached her south node, Pluto did. When she was arrested, she was in a 12th house perfection year, which, makes sense. Not that anyone in a 12th house perfection year would be arrested, but that if you're going to be arrested, that is a logical perfection year for it to happen in. Um, and also the whole secret enemies thing and all that. But anyway, Mars was also in her 12th house during that 12th house perfection year. And Mars is also the ruler of the 8th house and the 3rd house. We think about local community and how that was involved in her arrest. Okay. The South Node was at 4 Virgo in her first house when she started and was in her 12th house most of the year that she worked as a spy. So again, another example of one of the nodes working its way into the 12th house while the person is working as a spy. And the South Node had recently passed her chart ruler Mercury in the 12th house when she was arrested. Jupiter moved from her 6th house to her 7th house as well when she worked as a spy. So again, Jupiter in the 7th being somehow related to spy work. I'm still trying to figure that out. I would love comments and thoughts on that. And I mean, there is like that component of like the importance of like the deal like that you set up when you become a spy, and like you have like your contract that you're following, and you usually have like your handler or something like that. But like some of these people didn't have, it wasn't that organized, or like they were I don't know. It's just I would love to, I gotta think about this more, and I would love some ideas from others about Jupiter in the 7th and spy work. Okay, so that is Louise de Bettigny. Next, we're going to look at the chart of Noor Inayat Khan. She was a special operatives agent during the Second World War. She became the first female radio operator to be sent from Britain into occupied France to help with the French resistance. Um, she had Virgo rising, Mars in the 11th house with Neptune, Mercury in the 4th house with Pluto opposite Mercury, which was the chart ruler. She joined Special Operations February 1943. During her training, there was some question about her ability to do the work in terms of like they did like a pretend interrogation, which she struggled with. They said she was kind of clumsy, like physically, and that she had a little difficulty fitting into a crowd. But she was really good at wireless transmission. She was fluent in French, and she was super committed. Like nobody could doubt her commitment. So they let her, they didn't stop her from progressing into spy work. So February 1943, when she started, it was a 6th house perfection year. The South Node had just entered her 6th house. So that means the North Node had just entered her 12th house. Pluto was in the 12th house, applying to an opposition with her natal Uranus in the 6th house. Saturn was the Lord of the Year, and she was approaching her Saturn return in her 10th house. And Uranus had also just entered her 10th house when she gets this job that she really wants, right? Um, June 16th, 1943, she was sent into France. The Germans started rounding people up in her network shortly after, so it was like really difficult timing. Like 8 days later, they were already starting to get rounded up by the Germans. And that was when Pluto was exactly opposite her natal Uranus. As she's being like, this is early July, so like soon after they start rounding up people in her network, Pluto's exactly opposite her natal Uranus. Pluto in the 12th, her Uranus in the 6th. She was arrested October 13th, 1943. So her career as a spy is very short, right? Um, June to October, that's it. And when she was arrested, Saturn was stationing retrograde that exact day, 3 degrees from conjunct her Pluto in the 10th, and exactly opposite her natal Mercury, her chart ruler. So Saturn stationing opposite her chart ruler, Saturn in the 10th, her chart ruler in the 4th, the day she gets arrested. She was imprisoned over a year in horrible conditions, and then she was executed September 12th, 1944, which was a 7th house perfection year with Jupiter as the Lord of the Year, and the nodes were directly on her natal Jupiter and her natal Jupiter Neptune opposition, and Jupiter squaring her natal Saturn on the midheaven with Uranus, also conjunct those placements and opposing her moon. So yeah, really short career as a spy, but you can see like the different placements in her chart that really fit some of the patterns that I talked about, with that very like Plutonic feel with Pluto in the 10th there. And then you also have the Virgo rising, you have the Mercury in the 4th. There's that, like, even though I did see the most cases of the North Node in the 4th house, if I looked at either South or North Node, I noticed a lot also in the 1st and 7th, just not always the same direction. Like the 10th, there was hardly any very few cases where the north node was in the 10th and the south node was in the 4th. So if I look at the entire axis and add up how many charts had that axis for the nodes, those houses, um, it's not as high as the 1st and 7th, but if I just look at like specifically which node is in which house, then the 4th node, the north node in the 4th house was the most common, but this 1st and 7th axis in general was also very common. She has that as well, right near her ascendant. Yeah, so really sad story. Really inspiring woman. Very brave to go forward, even though, it was obviously very difficult for her in some ways. Um, but, it was something she believed in. So that is Noor Inayat Khan. Next, we'll look at the chart of Hans Thilo Schmidt. Hopefully I said that right. You can see from looking at his chart that he has Cancer rising again. He has this big Taurus stellium in the 11th with the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Neptune all up there. He has Pluto and the Moon, which is also his chart ruler, in the 12th house. And though the nodes are in the 2nd and 8th, they are still pretty close to the ascendant-descendant axis as well. And then you have Mars conjunct Uranus in the 4th house. So that's a lot of that fits some of the patterns that I saw. But then we have just some basic information about him. So he was a spy who worked in the cipher office of the German armed forces. Um, he sold information about the Enigma machine to French agents, and that allowed them to be able to, like a Polish mathematician was able to recreate the Enigma machine, so that then for like the next couple of years they were able to use that. The British used it to try to decipher the messages, so that they would be able to understand secret messages that the Germans were sending to each other. He approached, he approached the French in 1931 with offers to spy. Um, and in that year, it was a 7th or 8th house perfection year, depending on when in 1931. But either way, it was ruled by Saturn, and Saturn was in his 7th house and possibly stationing within orb of his descendant. And the nodes were in the 10th and the 4th house, and Pluto was in the 1st house, probably conjunct or even stationing his ascendant when that was going on. He did sell the secrets about the Enigma machine because that was just him approaching them. It took a little while for them to trust him also. But he did sell secrets about the Enigma machine in October 1932, which was the 9th house Jupiter year, and Jupiter was squaring his moon, which is his chart ruler in the 12th house. Pluto was stationing 3 degrees from his ascendant. And by early 1933, when they were able to recreate the Enigma machine using his intel, that was, sorry, I don't know where I was going with that. Okay. So that happened early 1933. It took them years before they were able to like really effectively use it. And then um unfortunately, like a lot of his career involved him trying to give intel and no one really taking him seriously. And so for example, one thing I saw was that in March 1940, he tried to warn the French about the invasion of the Ardennes by the Germans, but they like didn't really take it very seriously. The agent that he worked with was arrested by the Germans in March 1943. He gave Schmidt up as a spy. Then Schmidt was either executed or possibly killed himself. No one is certain. September 19th, 1943, which was another 7th house perfection year and then 8th house perfection year when he died. And Saturn was in the 12th house the whole time, transiting his natal moon, which is the chart ruler, and approaching his natal Chiron when he dies. So, Cancer rising, Gemini moon, the moon and Pluto in the 12th, that's Taurus stellium. There's a lot of here that is fitting the general patterns that I saw. Here's the chart for Violette Szabo. I said that right. She had Cancer rising. She had this stellium in the 1st house in Cancer, the Sun, Mars, Pluto, Mercury, both Mars and Pluto being common placements in the 1st house for the spies charts that I looked at. Venus in the 11th, Saturn on the IC, the Moon in the 9th with Uranus. So all of these things fit the patterns that I saw, generally speaking. So let's see, her husband died while he was fighting the Germans. in October 1942. And in June 1943, she volunteered to work as a spy. She left her young daughter, who had been born just a few months before her husband died. She left her daughter with her parents. And then by February 1944, so about 9 months after she volunteered, she was finishing parachute training and preparing for her first mission. Her first mission was a few weeks long, so it was April 6th through the 30th of 1944. And she was supposed to try to reestablish contact with different resistance members in the network and gather intelligence. She made it home safely from that first mission. Then her second mission, they parachuted into Southwest France to set up a new network with local resistance groups. Um, June 7th, 1944, so the day after D-Day, but she was caught 3 days later, June 10th, 1944. She was tortured. She was executed the following year, February 5th, 1945. Um, so when her husband died, before she volunteered to work as a spy, she's in a 10th house perfection year ruled by Mars, and Mars is transiting her fourth house, exactly conjunct her natal north node in the fourth house. Mercury in the fourth house is opposing her natal Chiron in the 10th as well. On her first mission, April 6th to the 30th, 1944, it was an 11th house perfection year. Venus is the Lord of the year, and Venus was conjunct the midheaven in the days leading up to the mission. Let's see, the moon in the third house was trine her natal Venus in the 11th house. Remember, it's a Venus perfection year, so that's extra significant. That was the morning that she parachutes in. The moon was trine her natal Venus. And the moon is also her chart ruler. Remember that too. So Jupiter in the second house was squaring her natal Venus, and she was also having an exact Mars return, conjunct her natal Mars and Sun conjunction, and which was also trine her chart ruler, the moon. So when they successfully returned on April 30th, Mars was conjunct her ascendant and trine her midheaven. Venus is right on her south node in the 10th house, and Uranus is squaring her natal moon. So that's all the first mission transits. Then the second mission, when she was caught, remember, there's only 3 days between her parachuting in and then getting caught. So Venus, the Lord of the Year, is now in her 12th house with transiting Uranus, the Sun and Saturn. And Venus is squaring her natal Jupiter in the third house. After she's caught, Mars squares her natal Venus in a Venus year. And then she moves into a 12th house perfection year ruled by Mercury. And the North Node is approaching her natal Mercury in the first house, then passing it, with Uranus in the 12th house square, her natal Uranus in the 9th house, the exact day she's captured. Then it stations retrograde a few degrees later and exactly square her natal Uranus again a few weeks before she's executed, which, let's see, is majorly slowing down at that point. And then the North Node is on her ascendant when she dies, and the Lord of the Year, Mercury, was entering her 8th house the day that she was executed. So those are some of her transits. Very depressing story. Here's the chart of Juan Pujol Garcia. He was a double agent, and we have Gemini rising again with Mars on the ascendant. He and Pluto in the first house as well. He had the Sun in the 9th, Mercury and Aquarius in the 9th house on the midheaven. And so he was a double agent for the UK. He pretended to spy for Germany, and he misled the Germans about the timing of the invasion of Normandy. And one website said he was one of the greatest double agents ever. And so he has the ruler of the 10th house, Jupiter, in Sag in the 11th house. His chart ruler is applying to a sextile with the ruler of the 10th house, and he was known as Agent Garbo, like for Greta Garbo, because he was such a good actor. Let's see. So transits, 1940 to 1942 was when he built up this fake identity for himself as this fanatical Nazi with, he like made up his own agents that worked for him to spy on the British. So then like if something went wrong when he if the Germans were like, well, how come your information was wrong? Then he could blame his pretend agents that like misled him. Or he could use them to like stall, like, oh, my agent didn't get to me, or something bad happened to my agent, and that's why it took me so long to get you this information, something like that. But with much better acting. So when he was building up this fake identity, he was having a Saturn return in the 12th house, 1940, with transiting Jupiter conjunct, and Jupiter's Lord of the Year. In 1941, still part of the time when he's building up this identity, he's in a Mars perfection year with transiting Pluto, reaching an exact sextile with his Mars on his ascendant and stationing there at the end of 1941, while Uranus is approaching a conjunction to his ascendant 5 degrees from Mars and 1 degree from the ascendant. And it stations there mid-1941. 1942, the British officially take him on as a double agent spy. By 1942, Saturn and Uranus have both crossed his ascendant, and the North Node's now in his 4th house, the South Node's in his 10th house, and Pluto's approaching his IC. Which I didn't see in a ton of transits for spies, but I did notice natally Pluto near the IC quite often. So it's interesting that that's where it was transiting for him. So June 6th, 1944, it says his biggest feat was in working as part of Operation Fortitude to convince the Germans that the invasion of France would occur at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. Even once the invasion began, he was able to convince the Germans that no, it's just a diversion, it's not the real invasion. And he even got Hitler to turn tanks around and bring them back to Normandy after the invasion, saying like this is really where the invasion is going to happen, the real invasion. And they basically just had, for like a couple months, they just had all of those forces just like waiting at Pas de Calais and not being used for anything, thanks to Garcia. So during that time when they were waiting for this fake invasion that he told them about, Uranus was trying his chart ruler Mercury in the 9th house. Pluto was conjunct his IC. In the month leading up to D-Day, so going back a little bit, Uranus station conjunct his Mars and trine his midheaven, and the Lord of the Year Saturn is the 8th house perfection, stationed retrograde conjunct his Pluto in the 1st house. So you can really see these like outer planet transits showing up in a big way for spies. And then in spring 1944, so we're still like moving back before D-Day. It was a 9th house perfection year. And so still Saturn's Lord of the Year. And Saturn stationed direct and reaches a conjunction with Pluto in his 1st house the day before, no, not the day before, but just before D-Day. And on D-Day, Uranus and Venus are both applying to a trine with his natal Mercury in the 9th house, his chart ruler, in a 9th house perfection year, with Pluto and Mars in Leo opposing his 9th house Mercury in midheaven from the 3rd house. And he needed to be this incredible actor and send the most important messages of his career at this time. He had all these major transits going on. It was like, the highlight of his career, basically. All right, so now we're going to look at the chart of William Edmund Ironside. He went by Edmund Ironside, and he was a senior British officer who, in the beginning of his career, spent a couple of years spying in Africa, but it wasn't really what he was known for. Like it sounds like he wasn't necessarily an amazing spy and that he had like a narrow escape. And then after that, he didn't do that kind of work anymore. By the time that, let's see, so he was born in 1880. He joined the military in 1899 when he was 19. And he served until 1940. By the time that he retired, he had actually reached the level of being chief of the Imperial General Staff at the beginning of World War II. So he had like this really successful military career for, 41 years. But in the very beginning of it, he had a couple of years where he worked as a spy from 1902 to 1904. According to Wikipedia, he disguised himself as an Afrikaans speaking Boer. I don't know if I said that right. I'm sorry. Boer. Taking a job as a wagon driver working for German colonial forces in German Southwest Africa. He had like a narrow escape after he was identified. And then after that, he worked as a spy undercover as a member of the German military staff in 1904. According to Wikipedia, witnessed German atrocities against the native inhabitants. And then that was pretty much it for his spying career. So just like looking at his natal chart really quickly, he's like the one example that had the most common rising sun and moon signs that I found in all the charts. He's the only one that had all three. So Cancer rising sun in Taurus and moon in Aries. He has the ruler of the 10th house in the 1st house, so Mars in the 1st. Mars near the ascendant was also a common thing that I saw. An angular Uranus also, nodes in the 1st and the 7th. I mean, there's a lot going on here. Saturn in the 10th. There's a lot of the like common characteristics showing up here. Neptune conjunct the sun. So it's a pretty like good example of a lot of the basic things that I saw showing up over and over again, which is funny because he only spied for a couple of years and it wasn't even what he was known for, but he had a little bit of everything in his chart. So, and like you can also see how like the chart ruler being in Aries, that's another thing that came up in a bunch of the charts. But a lot of these charts are people who were like, yes, they worked as spies, but they were also like very much like a part of the military. Like there was like a military background. So, that Aries connection with the chart ruler and then being in the military, that to me lines up pretty well. So, looking at transits, when he started spying in May 1902, Neptune had just entered his first house, like right as he started spying. And then when he stopped, it was still in his first house, but it had reached his south node in a first house perfection year. When he started spying, Pluto was in his 12th house, and when it was applying to a sextile with his natal Mercury, which is the ruler of his 12th house, and Saturn, because he has natal Mercury and Saturn conjunct, and Saturn, the ruler of his 7th and 8th house. And so Pluto was applying to his sextile with that conjunction, and that conjunction in his 10th house. So, like, this transformation of his career happening as this is occurring. And then Pluto was also opposite transiting Uranus in his 6th house. And Uranus seems to come up so much in the transits for spies, like when they're starting, when they're stopping, like when they have like major um, things occurring in their spying careers. So, a couple of months after he started working as a spy, the nodes entered his 4th and 10th houses. And then by the time he stopped, they were in the 9th and 3rd, and they were almost to the midheaven and IC, but they weren't quite there. And that makes sense because really it was after he stopped that his career really took off and he was sent to India. So you get that like midheaven and also the 9th house components occurring as the nodes are reaching the midheaven, and also as he is no longer spying, because that really things really took off for him after that point. When he started spying, Saturn was stationing in his 7th house, exactly square his natal Venus in the 10th house in a Venus perfection year. And he began spying during an 11th house perfection year, but then also like the bulk of his spying was during this 12th house perfection year, and then he finished during a first house perfection year. So all like very straightforward transits. All right. So David Sanchez Morales joined the Army in 1946. He was recruited into intelligence and joined the CIA in 1951 while maintaining his Army cover, according to Wikipedia. He doesn't have many of the common placements, but he does have Saturn, ruler of the 10th house, in the 7th house. The North Node in the 4th house, Pluto conjunct the IC. And then we'll see how these three components are emphasized during his career. He's also interesting because the most common sun sign for spies was Taurus, and then the second most common rising sign was Virgo, and he has it switched, Virgo sun with Taurus rising. So from Wikipedia, it says shortly after joining the CIA, Morales became an operative for the CIA's Directorate for Plans. It's alleged that he was involved in executive action, a series of projects designed to kill foreign leaders deemed unfriendly to the United States. Morales reportedly was involved in Operation PB Success, the CIA covert operation that overthrew the democratically elected president of Guatemala. Through the 1960s and mid 1970s, Morales was involved at top levels in a variety of covert projects. Some of these are like the plot to assassinate Fidel Castro, Bay of Pigs, CIA's secret war in Laos, and the capture of Che Guevara. And so there's like a bunch of stuff. And so I'm just like going through what Wikipedia says because a lot of this is like kind of unknown, like what exactly was he involved in, what extent was he involved in, but he was definitely there. There's like a bunch of documents you can find online, like largely redacted, but released documents that are showing like his amazing reports that he was like this, like considered this really top level operative in primarily South America. So like throughout the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, he died in 78. Okay, so dates are a little vague for exactly when he started and when he was done, but Neptune was on his chart ruler Venus in the 6th house when he began his army career. Uranus and the North Node were in his 2nd house, and it was a 9th or 10th house perfection year ruled by Saturn. In 1946, Pluto stationed in his fourth house, square his natal Saturn in the seventh house, and transiting Saturn was in his third house, first conjunct his IC, and then his natal Uranus in the 11th house, and then trine his natal Uranus in the 11th house. So, looking at some of the operations he was alleged to be involved in, Operation PB Success was June 18th to 27th, 1954. Um, and this was during a sixth house perfection year ruled by Venus. Transiting Venus was conjunct his north node in the fourth house during this operation, and then the south node was on his natal Pluto. And Mars, the ruler of his 12th house, was in his ninth house, square his natal Venus, so in a Venus year. And transiting Pluto was conjunct his natal Neptune. So and then Saturn was applying to conjunction with his descendant. So there's a lot of stuff going on during this operation that he was alleged to be involved in, a lot of major transits. And then another one, just one more example, the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. It was a 12th house perfection year for him, ruled by Mars. Mars was on his IC, and the North Node had just passed his natal Mars. Neptune was applying to a conjunction with his natal Saturn in the seventh house, and his chart ruler Venus was retrograde in his 12th house, square transiting Mars, so in a Mars year, on his IC, and applying to a square with his natal Pluto as well. And Venus stationed direct square his Pluto about a week and a half after the Bay of Pigs. During his career, Neptune was first in his sixth, and his seventh, and his eighth, and Pluto traveled from his fourth to his sixth, which means it was transiting conjunct his Neptune, Sun, Mercury, Mars, opposing his Uranus, squaring his moon. So Neptune and Pluto transits were pretty big for him during his career. And just like looking at his chart, like I said, there's not a lot of um the major patterns that you would expect to see, but you can see how like the couple of things that he does have, like that Pluto near the IC, like that's getting activated in major ways just in the couple of operations that I looked at. And then also that Sun in Virgo getting activated by Pluto throughout his career, and then also the 12th house and the 6th house coming up. And I noticed like when I was looking at like one of the things when I went into this research was whether or not the 6th house would be a major thing that showed up for birth charts of spies. In the birth charts, not so much. And this, in his case, it's a good example of one where it is his chart ruler in the 6th house. But I did notice it come up a lot in transits. So I'm just gonna throw that out there. And then also he has the North Node in his fourth house, which is another one of those few common patterns that does show up in his chart and was also activated at key moments in his career, as far as I can tell. All right, so George Blake this was kind of a fun one to look at, just because the transits are so interesting. But a brief bio from Britannica this time. Blake served in the Royal Navy until 1948. He was then appointed vice consul in Seoul, South Korea. He was captured after the North Korean troops captured Seoul. He was imprisoned from 1950 to 1953, and during that time, he secretly became a communist. He said afterwards that like witnessing the atrocities of war are what converted him to communism. Anyway, after his repatriation in 1953, he was assigned to the British military government in Berlin, and then in 1955, and then he had access to information of the British Secret Service, which he would then pass along. So he was working as a spy, like as soon as he was repatriated. And after his arrest in April 1961, he admitted to being a double agent, that he had given every important document that had come into his possession since 1953 to his Soviet contact, had betrayed many British agents, and he was sentenced to 42 years in prison in May 1961, which at the time was like a huge number of years to be sentenced for this crime. Um, and he escaped from prison October 22nd, 1966, so 5 years into his sentence, and he fled to the Soviet Union, which is where he spent the rest of his life. And his like escape story is really fascinating. But anyway, so he has Mars in the 11th house, Saturn the rule of the 10th on the descendant, Pluto 7 degrees from the IC, so he didn't count in my group of like Pluto on the IC that came up a bunch, but it was close, 7 degrees. And he has that Pluto also in an exact square with his ascendant descendant axis, which wasn't something I tracked in how many times that came up, but I think it also just further emphasizes that Pluto near the IC. And his Neptune in a tight square with his Sun, and Uranus in the South Node in his 12th. So in 1950 to 53, when this is like the period of time when he became a communist, 1950 was a fourth house perfection year, and Uranus had stationed in his fourth house conjunct his Pluto. 1951 was a fifth house perfection year, and there were so many big transits that year, including Pluto conjunct his natal Neptune in the fifth house, Neptune conjunct his natal Saturn in the seventh house, ruler of the 10th, and the North Node on his natal Uranus in the 12th house. So you have these like major activations of Pluto, Neptune, Saturn, Uranus, like all these like outer planets just like being like really highlighted that year while he's being imprisoned. He also had his Saturn return in 1952 while he was still being imprisoned. And then in 1953, he starts working as a spy. The nodes move into his 10th house and his 4th house. 1955, when he's spying in Berlin, Neptune enters his 8th house. Uranus enters his 5th house in a sign-based opposition to his chart ruler Mars in the 11th, and then it stations 6 degrees from an exact opposition. So Uranus really activating that chart ruler Mars when he's spying in Berlin. And it's during a 9th house perfection year, Jupiter perfection year, and stationing Uranus is also, so not only is stationing Uranus activating that Mars that it's opposite, but also it is activating through a square his natal Jupiter, which was the Lord of the year. And that's in, you can see in his birth chart that there's like this square between Mars and Jupiter in his 11th and his 8th. So the Uranus station is activating all of that year. Let's see. He was arrested April 1961. He admits to being a double agent during his Gemini third house perfection year. The nodes are still in the 12th and the 6th. Neptune is retrograde applying to his natal Mercury in the 8th. So the Lord of the Year. And square his natal Mars, the chart ruler, in the 11th. And Mars was in his 4th. So all that's going on when he is arrested during this third house perfection year. I just thought this was interesting, the escape transits. So October 22nd, 1966, he escapes from prison in an 8th house Mars perfection year. Mars is in his 6th house, opposing his natal Uranus in the 12th. So I love that Uranus in the 12th getting activated during a jailbreak. It's pretty awesome. And the very day he broke out, the moon is conjunct his natal Mars in a Mars perfection year. Transiting Saturn is in his 12th, applying to a conjunction with the South Node in his 12th, and transiting Pluto and Uranus are opposite. So all of that is getting played into these like major 12th house transits that are going on when he's breaking out of prison. And I also just love the South Node and Uranus being his natal 12th house placements, and then he breaks out of prison and it becomes like a big part of his story. So it's like a super interesting story. There's actually this really interesting article on Financial Times that I was reading. Like I want them to make a movie about this. I mean, there's like a documentary, but a short one, and I really want to see like an actual movie about it, because it was like, why did it take 25 years to solve his prison escape? That was like the name of the article. I can't remember the exact name, but it was something like that. And I just love that because like as he's breaking out, like Neptune is playing such a big role, like um conjunct his not his, conjunct the transiting Mercury, which was his Lord of the Year, and then in a trine with transiting Saturn, which is on his 12th house South Node, activating that, and it's in this 8th house perfection year, and Neptune's in his 8th, and it's just like, I love the Neptunian aspect of that, and then it took them 25 years to really solve this prison escape. So I do wonder if part of the reason that 12th house is so emphasized in so many of these charts is because naturally we are more likely to have charts of spies who were caught and imprisoned than we are the ones that never got caught. So yes, the 12th house comes up a lot, but if I had another 60 charts of people that we never knew about and never caught and don't have the details for, then it would be really interesting to see if the 12th house still shows up as much. I mean, it could still. There's like that secretive aspect to it, but I wonder. This is the chart of Richard Sakakita, who was an American spy in the Philippines um, during World War II. So he has, let's see, we'll look at his natal chart first. I'm basically just pulling his biographical information from Wikipedia. So in his natal chart, he has Jupiter, which is the chart ruler and the ruler of the 10th, and Saturn, both on his descendant. He's got Venus and Mars in the 11th, the Sun in the 9th, Moon and Uranus in the 1st. All of that being like characteristics I've seen in other charts as well. And then I like the Sun and Mercury and North Node in Scorpio in the ninth because details of his nationality being a secret were such an important part of his spy work. So from Wikipedia, on April 7th, 1941, he set sail for the Philippines only after only weeks of training. He literally just enlisted the month before. And upon his arrival in Manila, he was assigned to spy on the Japanese community in the city, posing as a merchant sailor who had jumped ship. He was in a ninth house perfection year, and Mars had just entered his 12th house and was squaring his nodes. It had been in his 11th house with his natal Mars when he enlisted the month before. But now he's in this Mars year, and Mars enters his 12th, and he starts spying. And I also like that it's squaring the nodes in the ninth and third because, he's also like moving to a new country to do this work as well. So when he travels, it's all to the Philippines. Mars is not only in the 12th, but it's also opposite, transiting Pluto in the 6th. Let's see, Neptune's in his 7th, applying to conjunction with his natal Saturn, as well as a trine with his natal Mars, which again was lower of the year. So Mars is getting activated and activating other placements all at once in a big way as he's starting this work. So after the outbreak of hostilities with Japan, Sakakita was imprisoned while still maintaining his cover as a civilian. He was recognized and released, and then it was talking about his different duties. He translated documents, interrogated Japanese prisoners of war. Um, the situation starts to deteriorate and they order him to leave. But then at like the last minute, he convinces them to let this other guy go because he's like, he has a family back home, let him have my seat. So he stays behind. The plane leaves April 13th, 1942. And on that day, Mars is on his IC, the day he lets the other man have a seat. The North Node is conjunct his natal Jupiter in the 7th, and Jupiter is Lord of the Year, it's a 10th house perfection year. And Pluto's still in the 6th, squaring his nodes. So he accompanies General Jonathan Wainwright as his interpreter during the surrender negotiations. Surrenders early May 1942. Sakakita, this is a quote, became the only Japanese American to be captured by the Japanese forces in the Philippines. So, because of Japanese law, he was considered to be a Japanese citizen because of his ancestry. He was charged with treason in November 1942. He was interrogated, tortured for 2 months, horribly tortured. And then after that, they dropped the charge of treason, but he was still imprisoned. When he's charged with treason, November 1942, Mars is in his ninth house. And during the 2 months that he's being tortured and imprisoned, he was in an 11th house perfection year ruled by Saturn. Saturn in his fourth house square his natal moon in the first. Also, the nodes had been in his first and seventh for the whole time that he was spying up until now, but then they move into his 12th and sixth during that period of time when he was being tortured. Neptune enters his eighth house soon before he's charged with treason, and then Pluto is stationing retrograde, square his nodes, and square transiting Mars as he's charged with treason. So all that's going on then. And then he spends nearly a year in prison, a couple different prisons, and then before his case was reviewed in, let's see, so he spends a year in prison. Colonel Nishiharu reviews his case in February 1943, decides he's innocent, hires him as a staff translator and a personal houseboy. And when that's happening, when he's being declared innocent and basically put on like house arrest, he, or, like forced servitude, Uranus is in his fourth house, squaring his natal Uranus in the first. And during the time that he is forced to do this work and forced to stay there as a houseboy, um, they're like constantly trying to trick him into giving himself away, but he doesn't. And even though they're trying to trick him, they still let him have access to sensitive material. So then he like memorizes it, steals it. He ends up getting in touch with the Philippine resistance. He passes information to them. He sneaks food to U.S. prisoners of war. When he's translating for the U.S. soldiers, he will like try to soften the things they're saying so that they won't get in so much trouble because maybe they had a hard time like controlling their temper or something. And so he would like find different ways to translate it so that he could like, basically help themselves. So all that's going on. And then in starting February 1943 and then October 1943, he enacts this plan with other there's other guerrillas involved, but he leads a band of guerrillas. He poses as a Japanese officer, according to Wikipedia, and plans this mass escape of like 500 inmates, Filipino prisoners, and then returns to the house and nobody even knows he was gone. When that happens, Uranus had gestation square his natal moon in the first, and then also the south node was in his 12th house opposite his natal Neptune in the sixth. So obviously, like the north node was on his natal Neptune in the sixth. And I just think that kind of reminds me of the prison break transits from George Blake that we just looked at too. So this whole time he's in a Saturn year, this whole time, like from the time that he is declared innocent but still forced to live at this house as a houseboy, and then including the outbreak of the breakout of the 500 inmates. During that whole time, he's in a Saturn year. Saturn is in his fourth house and transiting his IC as well, and he's basically in house arrest. So he stays there another year, and then December 1944, he decides it's time to flee. So basically, at that point, he's just going to live in the jungle. He doesn't have anywhere to go really. So for many months, he's living in the jungle. He doesn't hear any news. He doesn't know the war ends. And when that's going on, he's in a first house Jupiter perfection year, and Jupiter's in a seventh house conjunct his natal Saturn. Saturn's also transiting Saturn's on his natal Pluto, trine his moon in the first. Transiting Mars is in the 10th, opposite transiting Uranus in the fourth. So you have like that 10th and fourth being activated in a big way as he's, fleeing and then living in the jungle. And then it's also squaring his natal moon and Jupiter opposition in the first and seventh, and it's in a Jupiter year. So that's a really big transit right there as he does this. And then um, weeks after the war ends, he finally makes contact with American soldiers, and the nodes at that point are on his natal Venus-Pluto opposition in the 11th and 5th, and Pluto's approaching his Neptune, and Uranus is approaching his IC. So those are the transits for him. All right, here's the chart of Fritz Kolb. Hopefully I said that right. He was a German first clerk, then diplomat, then clerk again, who worked against the Nazis. He spied against on the Nazis to help first the French resistance and the Americans, and he ended up being this amazing spy. I have a quote here from Wikipedia that said by the end of the war, he had passed 1,600 documents to his handler in Switzerland. He is described by the Central Intelligence Agency as the most important spy of the war. Alan Dulles wrote, George Wood, our code name for him, was not only our best source on Germany, but undoubtedly one of the best secret agents any intelligence service has ever had. Okay, so he had Scorpio rising. His chart ruler Mars was in the 9th, the ruler of the 10th, the sun was in the 12th with Mercury and the moon, Pluto and Neptune in the 8th. He worked for the German government primarily as a diplomat, stationed first in Madrid, then Warsaw. Then he returned to Berlin for a little bit to take care of his wife while she was dying in 1936, while Uranus was in the 7th house at that point. Then he's transferred to Cape Town, South Africa. He refused to join the Nazi party, so they were kind of suspicious of him. And in South Africa, he would like meet with people who were very anti-Nazi, and so he wasn't like setting himself up to be well loved by the government at that point. And by 1939, he's demoted to clerk, and that happens just as Pluto's entering his 10th house. By 1941, so a couple years later, he has kind of worked to rebuild trust from his superiors because he's ultimately determined that he's going to undermine the Nazis. So by 1941, he's like determined, like, this is going to happen. I'm going to help defeat them, So he's been able to build up some trust. Like, they're still suspicious, and he knows he's being watched constantly. But he has a lot of access to sensitive information anyway. So while he's building this trust back up in those 2 years between 1939 to 1941, the nodes are in his 12th house and 6th house. But by 1941, when he decides he's like actively going to start resisting, the nodes are in his 11th and 5th. And I like that for him joining an organization, because he does actively start working with the French resistance. Uranus is squaring his midheaven and IC in 1941, and then it enters the 8th house. In 1942, he's actively helping the French resistance. He helps some Jewish people to escape with fake passports that he had from his days in South Africa. He informs the British about a German spy, and then that spy is caught and arrested. And all of this he's able to do while still being closely watched by his superiors and German officials in general, and then because he still wouldn't join the Nazi Party. So Neptune was transiting his 11th house this entire time, and I like that too because there's like that lack of clarity about like whose group does he really belong to, you know? So in 1943, a fellow anti-Nazi in the ministry was able to promote him to work as a diplomatic courier. And Neptune was in his 11th house, squaring his natal Neptune. So it's all the way up to 29 degrees at that point. And then on August 19th, 1943, just as Neptune's entering his 12th house, he's finally allowed to travel to Switzerland with the diplomatic bag. And I say finally because he had been trying for a while as he was like building up trust and getting more access and trying to like work against the government. At the same time, he had been trying to apply for different positions that would allow him to leave the country, but he kept getting shut down because he wouldn't join the Nazi Party. So they didn't trust him enough to do that. But he's finally able to go to Switzerland at this point. And then in Switzerland, he tries to approach the British embassy to be like, look, I have all these secret documents you can have, but they didn't really trust him. So then he goes to the Americans and they're like, okay, we'll give you a chance. And they eventually realize, that he's this amazing agent and he is able to pass them like 1,600 documents and he's never paid for any of it. But so when the Americans decide they're going to take a chance on him, at that point, the nodes are in his 10th house and fourth house. And Pluto's also in his 10th house. Neptune is in his 12th house, applying to a conjunction with his sun, and Uranus is in his 8th house, just weeks from stationing and then applying to a conjunction with his 8th house south node. So he ends up being this incredible agent, like I said, and I think the transits are pretty clear, and you can just look at like the big picture stuff, and it seems pretty obvious, like how it sort of plays out in his chart, and it's pretty cool. I'm going to start going through these a little bit quicker because I'm running out of steam. So, Douglas McKiernan was a spy for the CIA. He is known as the first spy for the first officer of the CIA to be killed in the line of duty. He has Virgo rising, Sun and Taurus, applying to square with Uranus in the 6th. He has Saturn and Pluto in the 10th. The chart ruler, which is also the ruler of the 10th house, Mercury, is in the 8th, and Neptune is in the 11th. He worked as a spy for the US, primarily in China from 1947 to 1950. He was killed April 29th, 1950, while trying to cross the border into Tibet. Unfortunately, the US government had like waited too long to let the Tibetan government know that they would need to cross, and by the time they did, the Tibetan government didn't have time to relay the message, and I guess the news that they were safe to cross reached the Tibetan guards like just days after it all went down. So, in 1947, when he started working for the CIA, he had just started an 11th house perfection year. His north node was in his 10th, transiting his Saturn, and then it moved into his ninth. Uranus was approaching his 10th house, Pluto. While he was a spy, Pluto was in his 12th house the entire time. Uranus passed his Pluto and moved into his 11th house. So when he died, the North Node was in his 8th house, conjunct his chart ruler Mercury. He had also just entered a second house Venus perfection year, and transiting Venus was conjunct his seventh house Mars, and trine his 11th house Neptune. All right, and Ernesto Montgomery is kind of an interesting one because he claimed to be psychic and was apparently hired as a psychic spy to help predict the events of D-Day. It's a little unclear and it's hard to find information. There are a lot of wild claims out there about him, but regardless, it does seem like he was hired to play this role. So whether or not he actually was psychic, he did at least temporarily work as a spy in a sense. So he has some of the patterns that I've noticed, like he has let's see, he's got Cancer rising, he's got the moon in the 10th in Aries, he's got Pluto on the ascendant, Jupiter on the descendant. Um, and then it's interesting that he also has this like little mini fourth house stellium with the Sun, Mercury, and Mars there, just because like I've heard the fourth house connected to psychic things. So that's interesting. And I am not going to spend too long on this because it's really hard to know exactly what even happened, but I did look just quickly at the transits for just like the month before D-Day because I couldn't get any dates exactly for when he was hired or what exactly he did. But shortly before D-Day, the North Node entered his first house, and Neptune was applying to conjunction with his Mars in the fourth. But honestly, there wasn't a ton of other things going on like all of the other spies I've looked at, which makes me kind of question the whole story and how it actually played out. So if anyone has any more information on this, I would be interested because it sounds like a really cool story, regardless of what was really going on or what his abilities were or the extent of his involvement. But anyway, I'd be interested if anyone knows anything else. All right, so this is the chart of Henri Pique. He was a spy against the Germans for the Russians. He was first recruited in 1932, and he continued to spy until 1937 when his contact was murdered. And then in 1941, he was arrested for resistance activities, spent the rest of World War II in German custody, eventually sent to a concentration camp, but was not killed because they wanted him. He was a painter and they wanted him to keep painting so they could sell the paintings to make money. But in the time that he was working as a spy for Soviet intelligence, he was handing over telegrams, code books, other correspondence. So yeah, so this is his chart, and there aren't a ton of the like common placements in his, but there are a few. So we have Jupiter in the seventh, we have the moon in the second, we have Mercury in the fourth. All of those things are common house placements that I saw. There's also that Gemini stellium there with Venus, Pluto, Neptune, and Mars all in the sixth house in Gemini. And then also having some major placements in the 11th house is something that came up a lot, even if it wasn't always necessarily Saturn and Uranus, which is what he's got in the 11th house. But Saturn is also his chart ruler, so it's pretty significant having that there. When he was first recruited, the major transits that were going on where Pluto was approaching his descendant. He had Neptune in the ninth, and he had also just had his nodal returns in the ninth and third house. And I think there was one other thing that was going on, which was, oh yeah, Uranus was approaching his sun as well at that time when he was recruited. Then if I look at when he was arrested, he was in an 11th house perfection year, Mars perfection year, and Mars was in his third house, squaring that whole Gemini stellium that he has going on. But then also he was having his nodal reversal. So the nodes were in the ninth and the third. Mars is approaching his north node, and his natal Mars was also squaring the transiting nodes. So there's a lot going on then when he was arrested involving Mars, Lord of the Year, as well as the nodes. Here's a chart for Dominique Prieur. She was a French military officer who was recruited as a secret agent in August 1977. She was Aries rising with the moon and north node in Aries conjunct her ascendant. The chart ruler Mars is in Gemini, as well as the Sun and Mercury in Gemini. Neptune in the seventh is square her midheaven and icy axis. And when she was first recruited, it was a fifth house perfection year. She has Pluto in her fifth house natally. And when this happened, transiting Neptune was trine her Pluto, while transiting Pluto was conjunct her Neptune. And so they're both activating each other. And then she also just had a Mars return as well as a nodal reversal at that point. Just a little Wikipedia summary of like the major event that she's known for. In July 1985, she entered New Zealand from Corsica on a Swiss passport, undercover. She was instructed to sink the ship, the Rainbow Warrior, because the French government suspected it would be used to protest the upcoming nuclear tests in the South Pacific. So her responsibilities were the logistics and evacuation of agents from the country after the bombing had taken place. She delivered limpet mines to plant on the ship's hull on the night of July 10th, 1985, and the explosion sank the vessel and killed a photographer named Fernando Pereira. So they were arrested by New Zealand police within 30 hours of the bombing and charged with the murder. She was transferred to a women's prison. Then she pled guilty for charges of manslaughter and willful damage. She was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. And then, because of pressure from France, they eventually transferred her to French custody in the French Polynesia. And then there's more to it, but not really having to do with her as a spy. So just for transect, looked at July 10th, 1985, when they blew up the ship, and it was a first house Mars perfection year. Transiting Mars was applying to a square with her ascendant and descendant axis, as well as her nodes in the moon. And Neptune had recently entered her 10th house, and Pluto had recently entered her 8th house. Here's the chart of Francis Tomperville. He was a French-born doctor of physics, um, nuclear physics specifically, and he was a spy who was recruited by the KGB. He provided the Russians with 96 documents in the years from 1989 to 1990, and he was arrested in 1992. He has Aries rising, the moon in Aries, and the first chart ruler Mars is in Gemini, and he has Pluto trine his moon and Uranus trine his ascendant and Neptune in the eighth. While he was spying, Neptune was in his 10th house and Pluto in his 8th house. And it was primarily a 7th house Venus perfection year, so that Neptune in the 10th was actually trine his natal Venus, and that Pluto in the 8th was actually opposite his natal Venus for the bulk of the time that he was working as a spy, which really wasn't very long. And also during that time, the transiting nodes were conjunct and opposite his natal Pluto in the 5th. Here's a chart from Maurice Southgate. This is from Wikipedia. He was an officer in the Royal Air Force, an agent of the United Kingdom's clandestine Special Operations Executive Organization during World War II. Just going to read the important parts. He was the organizer of a large network centered in central France from 1942 to 1944. He was captured in 1944 and deported to a concentration camp, but he did survive. And it says that he was regarded as one of France's best agents. So if we look at his chart, you can see he has the moon in the second, which is one thing that I did see him come up a lot. He also has the sun in Gemini, as well as Pluto and Saturn. He has Saturn conjunct the descendant, which is also another thing that came up a lot. He has the North Node in the 4th house, another common characteristic that I saw. And then also I'm noticing more and more this Neptune in the 8th as well. So I'm just going to quickly look at some of the transits just for that 2-year period, 1942 to 1944. He was in 6th, 7th, and 8th house perfection years. Uranus had just entered his 7th house, and during that 2-year period, it crossed his descendant. And he also went through his Saturn return with Saturn in his 7th house during that time. And then by the end of that 2-year period, Saturn was approaching his natal Pluto in the 7th house. So a lot going on in that area. Pluto, transiting Pluto it was in the 9th house the entire time, but by 1944, it had reached in opposition to his natal Uranus in the 3rd and was also squaring his, earlier in 1942, it was squaring his natal Mars in the 6th house as well. In 1942, Neptune was approaching his south node in the 10th house, and then it was still there in 1943, and by 1944, it entered his 11th house and crossed his midheaven there as well. Here's the chart of Francis Settle, who was a UK special agent during World War II. He led a major resistance network in France called the Prosper Network, and he was a part of a lot of major operations. He parachuted into France October 1st, 1942, and was captured by the Germans and then executed in June of 1943, specifically June 24th, 1943. So looking at his birth chart, some of the common placements that I saw in the 60 spies charts that I looked at that I see showing up in his chart are Mars in Gemini, the multiple placements in Gemini as well, Mars, Pluto, and the moon all in Gemini. The North Node was most commonly found in the 4th house, like it is here, having an important placement in the 12th house, like his Venus in the 12th house. And I think those are like the major things that I would point out there. So if I look at the transits, so for October 1st, 1942, when he parachuted into France, this was, let's see, he was 32, so 9th house perfection year, so it was a Mars year. Mars was in his 8th house, applying to conjunction with his Jupiter there in the 8th. And Jupiter, remember, is his chart ruler also. So Mars was applying to a conjunction with his chart ruler, and it was a Mars perfection year. So that's pretty major. And then The nodes were in the 1st and 7th, but they were about to move into the 12th and 6th, which we saw in some other charts that we looked at earlier. Um, Neptune's in the 4th, conjunct his North Node and Mars. Saturn is applying to a conjunction with his Moon in the 4th, and Pluto's in the 6th. And those are the major things for that. And then if I look at the day that he was captured by the Germans, the nodes are definitely well into the 12th and 6th house at this point, and in fact, the South Node is conjunct his natal Venus in the 12th house. And Neptune is still, like, this whole time, it's just been kind of hanging out there right at the end of the 7th house. It's still there. But at this point, when the day he's arrested, it's in an opposition to the moon, which is conjunct his sun in the 1st. Mars is applying to a conjunction with his Saturn in the 2nd. He's in a 10th house perfection year, so Jupiter's the lord of the year. And Jupiter is in his 5th house opposite Uranus in his natal Uranus in the 11th house. Here's the final chart I'm going to look at, and that's the chart of Julia Child, who was not known for being a spy, but did work in intelligence before she switched to cooking later on after she got married and the war ended and she was in France. So I'm just going to read a little summary from the CIA website. So it says that soon after the U.S. entered World War II, Julia felt the need to serve her country. Too tall to join the military, she was 6'2". Julia volunteered her services to the Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of today's CIA. She was one of 4,500 women who served in the OSS. From 1944 to 45, she was sent overseas and worked in Ceylon, which is present-day Sri Lanka, and also in China. During these last 2 years in the OSS, Julia served as chief of the OSS registry. She had top security clearances, knowing every incoming and outgoing message that passed through the office, and her registry served all the intelligence branches. During her time in Ceylon, she handled highly classified papers that dealt with the invasion of the Malay Peninsula, and she was fascinated with the work even when there were moments of danger. Not only did she contribute to the efforts of the OSS, but this is also where she met her husband. He was also an OSS officer, and the two married in 1946. And then after that, he was assigned with the U.S. Information Agency in France in 1948. But after the war, she no longer worked in this field at all. And then that's when she began to study culinary arts. So essentially, 1944 to 1945 were like the primary years, and then after the war, she was done. So if we look at her natal chart, she's got Gemini rising, and she has Saturn on the ascendant, Jupiter on the descendant. She's got the nodes in the 11th and the 5th, and then she has a few planets in Virgo as well, Mars, Mercury, and Venus all in Virgo, and Mercury in the 4th, which was one thing that did come up a lot. But like, you wouldn't expect, since like she was known for so many other things and spent so much of her life doing other things, that her chart would just like fit all of the stereotypical placements that I saw. And so it's interesting when I was able to look at 60 charts and compare so many that included charts like this where the person just worked as a spy for a brief period of time, that there were still those similarities that show up. And so I just find that really interesting. And ruler of the 10th and the 7th is another placement that I did see several times as well. So that is her natal chart, and then I'm going to look at some of the transits just for those couple of years. So I don't have specific dates, so I'm just going to look at this pretty quickly and just focus on the outer planet transits and the nodes, which have longer transits. So in 1943, I'm just looking at April 19, sorry, that's 1944. In 1943, no, it was supposed to be 1944. Okay. So in April 1944, that was just a month I picked randomly, because we're looking at 1944 to 1945. We have Uranus on the ascendant, and Saturn, Uranus on the Saturn ascendant conjunction in her natal chart. We have Neptune in her 5th house, trine that ascendant and Saturn. There's the node, the south node is transiting south node is on her natal Uranus in the 9th. And also Pluto is in a sextile to its retrograde and applying to it, sextile with her ascendant and her Saturn as well. And then Pluto kind of hangs out there during the course of these couple of years. It stations retrograde, stations direct, and it's kind of just bouncing between a sextile with her ascendant and Saturn in the first, and a sextile with her moon in the fifth. And Saturn is in her first house, and that is throughout the entirety of this time. So to wrap it all up, I did feel like I saw some interesting patterns when I looked at 60 different charts from 60 people who, at least at some point in their life, worked as a spy. Um, and again, some of the most common placements I saw were Cancer rising or Virgo rising, Sun in Taurus, Sun in the 11th or the 9th, an angular Jupiter, Saturn, or Pluto, Mars or Neptune on the ascendant, Venus or Pluto on the IC, Jupiter, Saturn, or Uranus on the descendant, Gemini or first house stellium, the moon in Aries, the moon in the first, second, or ninth, Mars in Gemini, Mars in the 11th, 10th, or 1st, Mercury in the 4th or in Aquarius, Pluto in the 1st or the 12th, the ruler of the 10th and the 12th. I also saw the ruler of the 10th and the 7th a lot. That was the second most common. I should have mentioned it here. Prominent Mars, Neptune, or Pluto, the chart ruler in Aries or Gemini, Neptune in the 1st or the 7th, Saturn in the 7th or the 10th, Jupiter in the 7th. There were so many different things that I saw. That felt like they made a lot of sense to me. And then when I started looking at specific stories, I could see why certain parts of these, like certain placements from this list, would show up in one person's chart versus another's, because their lives were also different and their careers were so different. And I also noticed when I was looking at the transits, even though I didn't have a lot of concrete dates for some people, it was really interesting to just look at general periods of time and see like what kind of perfection years were they going through, what were the outer planet transits like, which houses were they in, where were the nodes. I was really interested to see how often the transiting nodes would move from like the first and the seventh to the 12th and the sixth as the person was beginning their career as a spy. Also noticing like Neptune in the 7th or the 8th, or moving from the 7th to the 8th. I saw that a lot. There were so many things. And then also seeing how, like, if one of the placements, one of the key placements in their birth chart that was from this list of the common placements that I saw, if there was only a few things in their birth chart that was from this list, then they tended to be the things that were really highlighted by those transits while they were working as spies. So I found it really interesting, and I know that this was pretty long, and I couldn't even go into the detail that I would have liked to about different people's lives and their interesting stories. I just try to do a quick overview so that hopefully it will inspire some of you to look into it more yourself, and then also share anything cool that you find, because I would love to hear more. Or if you know about other spies that I didn't talk about, I'd be really interested in that. They might have been in part of the 60 charts group that I have, but maybe not. So I'd love to hear about it. And yeah, hopefully it was as interesting to some of you as it was for me. Bye, guys.